Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here on stage today to moderate this senior panel with a focus on Europe, and where the central question is whether consolidation, additional consolidation and growth of European financial market infrastructures is key or not to a deeper capital markets union, or CMU as we will refer to it. With me to discuss this topic, I have representation from both the regulatory side and from the CSD side. Each of them obviously has a slightly different angle on the question, which we're going to debate. So let's quickly introduce them, starting with you, Jennifer.
Good afternoon, Jennifer Robertson, Head of Unit for Market Infrastructures at the European Commission.
Andrea Gentilini, Head of Market Infrastructure Divisions SSF, the Luxembourg regulator, and chairing the post-trading working group at ESMA.
Jesus Benito, Head of Domestic Custody and Trade Repository Operations and the CEO of the Spanish CSD.
Ilse Peters, Head of Government Relations of Euroclear.
Attila Toth from EBRD, Capital and Financial Market Development team dealing with mainly Central European countries, of course.
Thank you. So the Capital Markets Union is an action plan to integrate national capital markets in Europe into a single capital market, European capital market. And over the last years, the policymakers have been very active in adopting numerous pieces of regulation, as we just heard, under the flagship of CMU. Financial market infrastructures and their participants, in turn, have been very busy implementing these regulatory projects in parallel to their own infrastructure projects. But are we touching the limits of integrating markets through regulation? And on the flip side, is the regulatory impulse sufficient? Or should financial market infrastructures play a much more active role in integrating capital markets through industrial rather than regulatory projects? And if so, how to integrate? Is it at all possible given the divergent legal grounds and market practices in which we operate? How far can we go? And in the end, what's in it for FMIs? I must say I'm relatively new to this world of FMIs, and when at the beginning, I kept hearing this urban legend that goes somewhere along the lines of CSDs are a thing of the past, like dinosaurs. At some point, they will disappear. And integration, harmonization, consolidation is happening everywhere, but nothing's happening in the post-trade world. Well, it's not really true, because if we look around us, there is consolidation happening in Europe. Groups are emerging. There's the Euroclear, the Clearstream groups, there's the NASDAQ group, that's the 6 BME group, my own Euronext group with 4 CSDs. So FMIs are actually consolidating the European space. So I would like to start by maybe just clarifying, making sure that we all understand the same thing under consolidation. What does consolidation actually mean? And is it what we need to achieve a deeper capital markets union? Starting with Ilse, what's your take on it?
Sure, Olga. I think the first thing we had when we prepared for this panel was a discussion about what is consolidation, what is concentration, what is integration. And so I would like to offer some views there that may be a bit controversial or not. And I will talk about them in turn. So I'll talk about consolidation, concentration, and integration. When people talk about the CSD world, and I've been around in the policy area for quite a while, there seems to be a general, I would say, frustration that there are still so many CSDs in the EU, and we heard Alina, and it's, I think, over 30. And so the question is nothing happening? That is what I want to offer as a view, is that what we're talking about when we say there are so many CSDs, it's the number of legal entities, it's the number of authorized CSDs. But that doesn't mean necessarily that underneath nothing has happened. So I would like to say the number of CSD is a very partial metric to see where the CSD is heading to. So it's not, the number of CSDs is just a metric, it is not the metric. So the number of CSDs, why don't they basically merge? Because we're talking legal merger. If you take the real consolidation is legal merger, is basically the conditions in the EU are not there. And we all know why that is true. We have no, I would say, no single corporate law. We have no single securities law, no single regulator, no single many things. So this is the environment in which we are playing. So the CSDs play in the environment which is imperfect, and there is, we think, not a political will now and maybe not in the foreseeable future to really cure, I would say, these basic foundations that would eventually allow CSDs to legally merge. So I don't think if we have this conversation 5 years from now, I don't think we'll have a material change to the number of CSDs. So that is a first element. Then concentration, as Olga mentioned, indeed we have a number of groupings of CSDs in the EU. And what this allows to do is, if you have a group of CSDs, like the Euroclear group, we have 7 CSDs in the group. We have been able to make quite some synergies in how these CSDs operate. So we have quite a lot of things that are done in common, and that is IT. I mean, we talk about cyber resilience, operational resilience, also risk management, the control functions. All of that is shared amongst the CSDs. So we've created quite some synergies, which is going in partially, but it is going in the direction of creating a more integrated FMI sector. And then I would go to the next stage, and I know there's more to come on that, is integration. And integration is basically a result of a long efforts that have been done in the EU for harmonization of certain practices. We've done a lot of harmonization in the frame of the Target 2 Securities platform, in the frame of CSDR, and there is still harmonization ongoing, and that harmonization allows for more integration to come, that together with the CSDs linking into each other. So, but against that, I would want to pause one thing, is all these elements are important, but what is the most important element is that the CSDs have been exceptionally good at doing their core role. They have been very resilient, safe infrastructures, and I think this is what we should all underline against this backdrop of, which is very, very much needed for capital markets unions, that you have safe and efficient market infrastructures.
Absolutely, absolutely. Jennifer, do you have the same definition of these concepts?
I'm not going to give a complete run by run. I didn't take notes. I didn't realize it was going to be a test. So I'm not going to comment on the definitions proposed by Ilse. I think what is important to maybe say is that consolidation is maybe a tool. It's not an objective in itself. The focus from our perspective is very much on, as Ilse concluded, building safe and efficient securities settlement markets, because by having these safe and efficient capital markets, they act or market infrastructures, they act as the foundation stones on which we can build a deeper, more liquid and efficient capital market in the European Union. Now the question is, how can you actually achieve these goals? I think over the last few years, and not even last few years, decades, there have been quite a lot of changes on the market. I mean, we've seen mergers. We saw the emergence of Clearstream through the mergers of Sedel and Deutsche Börse in 2012. We saw CSDs joining together as groups, the Norwegian and the Danish CSDs joining the Euronext group. And we've also seen the emergence of horizontal synergies since 2009 with Euroclear, just to name but a few under one, as well as, of course, the NASDAQ initiative, which Ilse mentioned as well in the Baltics. So I think we are seeing a lot of activity on the markets, but that doesn't necessarily mean consolidation as such. These initiatives have certain goals in mind, and that is to facilitate and to help promote a more efficiently functioning market and to make things work better by increased standardization, increased common processes, and by harmonization. Now the question is that enough? Is that enough to build a safe and efficient market? I think the simple fact is that fragmentation does still exist. There are different processes. We see that things do not still work optimally. Alina referred to settlement efficiency. There are still suboptimal levels. Things can improve, and we need to continue to work to help them improve. But we do have lots of efforts. I mean, T2S, the European Central Bank settlement platform, is continuing to grow, which will also help both promote standardization, but also more deeper and liquid markets. But there's a lot of work still ongoing, and this needs to continue. We do need to build a more integrated market in the sense that common standards, common processes, so that different forms of CSDs talk to each other. But let's be honest, this doesn't always happen by itself. I have to mention this, and sometimes this does need a little bit of a regulatory push. Maybe I'll just leave it for there, because we're going to come back to that, I'm sure, later.
We will. And actually, I would like to pick it up from where you said, is it enough? Jesus, what's your view on this? Are FMIs doing enough? Are they doing what's needed to achieve integration? Are there sufficient bold industrial projects to get there?
Well, thank you. I think definitely we have done a lot. And I hope you are not surprised by saying myself that we seize this trying to do our best in order to have an integrated financial market in Europe. I think the important point, I fully agree with the definitions of fields about the consolidation and integration. I think it is extremely important to be able to have an integrated settlement landscape in Europe. And I really believe that there are the pieces there to achieve that. Still, maybe we are not in the final outcome of this long road, that long travel that we are having in our CSDs, but I think we are in the good direction. T2S has been a tremendous effort together, the European Central Bank, the 4 central banks, the 4 CBE, and the CSDs. For the CSDs have been a project of 10 years. And we dedicated a lot of efforts and resources to have in place T2S. And once we signed the framework agreement in 2012, we were fully dedicated to be able to migrate in the waves that we had assigned. And actually, it's not just this story has been finished. We still have a lot of projects from the European Central Bank. We still have a lot of resources every day to deal with T2S. There are things to be improved, and we are helping very much in the CSD steering group that we have of the CSDs and that Berkeley is chairing. We are trying to do our best to help the 4CB and the ECB to improve it. So actually, it's not just that we have the T2S, it's just also, I think, and I fully agree with Alina, CSDR is a milestone for this industry. It is extremely important together, T2S, the technical possibility to be interconnected in the same integrated platform, and the CSDR with the level playing field and the rules to be able to compete. And now we are competing, but we are competing and also cooperating. And apart from all of these projects, which are very important from the European Central Bank, in addition to T2S, the consolidation we have ahead of us, 1 year ahead in April next year, we have Eurosystem collateral management system, the standardization, the score standards for fixed income instruments. We have done a lot of efforts in harmonization in all of our countries, especially, if I can tell you, in Spain we have been, and we still are, in the process of fully harmonizing, probably by the next year. So all in all, we have done a lot of things, not only from the European Commission, Shareholder Right Directive 2, Of course, DORA, everything related to settlement discipline regime, it was a huge effort to implement it and to try to educate the market to reduce as much as possible the settlement failures. To sum up, I think we are doing a lot. There are things to be done, of course, but of course, step by step.
So it's not just following the regulatory impulse. There's definitely willingness there on the CSD side to actually launch projects in addition to the regulatory needs to further harmonize and further integrate. Attila, how do you see this? And do you see a difference between state-owned CSDs and privately owned CSDs?
Yeah, so as EBRD is active and present in Central Europe and Central Asia, and let's say more in the emerging markets, not in the developed Western European markets, of course, state ownership is not marginal. Let's say it's very important. And I see that there are two different and sometimes not compatible approaches how the CSDs are, let's say, organized or handled by the state. First of all, it's considered as a utility, critical infrastructure, strategic asset, and the main focus should be to provide this basic infrastructure for the local ecosystem. And that's the first priority and sometimes the only priority. And the second is the CSD should support the capital market development via provision of value-added services and linkages, make it easier to access to the market by all market participants. But this second one also brings many risks for the first one sometimes. That's the perception of many countries. And meanwhile, the first one is all about control, whether they control the full infrastructure or not. The second one is always some, let's say, about giving up at least partially the control. Because whenever we are talking about consolidation, cooperation, that means we need to interact with others. That means we will lose at least partially the control over our own infrastructure. And that's a very tough decision, of course, to make. And that's why I think many countries, the CSDs are less reluctant, or more reluctant to support the cross-border connectivity solutions. And but that does not mean that there is no consolidation or integration even in Central Europe, because there are different levels of consolidation or integration. Because if it does not happen at the level of CSD, then the market will solve that. And what is happening? Global custodians, of course, they integrate these markets. They provide a single access to all these markets in Central Europe. But of course, the question is, what is the cost side? And if this consolidation is done on that level, then the decision is not made by the CSD where and how they can be linked. It is done by the market participants based on a cost-benefit analysis. And if you have a smaller market, less relevant market, less chance that you will be connected to the global ecosystem at the end. So that's why for all these CSDs, the very first issue is not linking the markets, but to give access, to increase the accessibility of their infrastructure. And the second is, let's say, talk about harmonization, to diminish and decrease the differences between the systems. But that's the key, because everybody is supportive of any kind of consolidation until it does not mean that they need to change their own procedures. Because everybody is convinced that their standards, their local system is the best.
So would you then say that in those instances it's even more important that there is regulatory impulse?
Yes. Do you know the answer whether the VHS system was the best in the 80s, 90s?
Yeah.
The proper answer is, who cares?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter at all.
Yeah. So coming back to regulation, Jennifer, you had a few more points, and I would say some would say there's too much regulation. You know, you probably hear that all day long. Regulation has been pushed to its limits, and even now the refits, the reviews of existing regulation bring in new points. Is what's the role of regulation to really drive this further integration to make markets more efficient?
Okay, I mean, the role of regulation, well, I mean, I think I'll focus on the role of CSDR because that's the regulation that we have, which regulates CSDs in the European Union. And the main goal of CSDR, as I mentioned earlier, is to make sure that the markets work efficiently and that settlement and CSDs are safe. And I think everybody agrees broadly with those objectives. I mean, the 2008 crisis showed that there were risks that needed to be addressed, so we came forward with the CSDR. It was the first piece of regulation regulating CSDs at the European Union level, I mean, it has not been an easy path. I think there have been some challenges, and many of those challenges, what we tried to do is we tried to recognize those in our most recent review of CSDR. This is a review that is currently ongoing. It's not yet finished, but we hope it will be finished very soon. But the goal of the CSDR review was to learn the lessons, to see how things could be, to see how the regulatory framework could be improved, to make it work better, to make it work more efficiently, to see where certain requirements could be more proportionate and maybe weren't even needed at all. So, I mean, the CSDR review is ongoing. It will hopefully be finalized in the coming months. It's with the Parliament and the Council right now, not with us. But it will lead to regulatory changes, and that will mean that CSDs and regulators have to adapt and have to change, and that will include, of course, certain costs. I mean, there's nothing that is, there's no such thing as a free lunch, I'm afraid. But I think what we need to focus on are also the benefits that we'll bring. And I think we tried to improve the regulatory framework in several ways. Just to name a few, we amended the settlement discipline regime because it was proving extremely problematic for many firms and regulators, and the number of questions was growing by the day. So what we did is we tried to make it more proportionate and work to learn our lessons and to make it work better. But we also heard from many CSDs about the challenges that they were facing, for example, trying to provide services cross-border within the European Union, and we thought that this had to change. This had to be more improved. We need to make it easier for you to be able to provide your business cross-border, where of course you want to. It's not an obligation, but it's a chance for firms to grow their businesses. We also took a fresh look at, we call it the rules on banking type ancillary services. So the role of commercial bank money compared to central bank money. And what we tried to do is give them a revamp to see if we got the balance right the first time, to take into account and to adjust potentially to the needs of some smaller CSDs. So, I mean, I think that there are a lot of benefits there for the taking once this CSDR review is in place. But maybe just before I conclude, just to say this is what we're doing on the regulatory side, and it certainly by no means does not mean that the market doesn't have a role to play. And I think, the debate on everybody's, the tip of everybody's tongue is, of course, T+1. I mean, is this something that needs to be regulated, or is this something to be discussed, or is this to be reflected? Maybe it's just useful to say T+1 is already possible under EU law. There's nothing stopping it. So I think these are good examples that if the market wants to move, and if the market wants to move ahead, these are areas, there are opportunities out there for the taking. Legislation is there to support, to help, to regulate where needed. But for example, in the T+1, this is something we will do and look into with the market, if, as Alina was mentioning. just to say, to conclude, I mean, regulation enables, it facilitates, but if necessary, and it has to step in and address specific issues.
Yeah, and sometimes you believe it is necessary that
Yes.
regulation steps in.
Yes.
Andrea, how would you say can regulation become more of an enabler?
Well, indeed, I think that first I will say we need to start to read in a different way regulation. And hearing what Jennifer said now, bring me in my mind the fact that very often when we read regulation, we jump immediately to article first, and we skip the recitals. However, the recitals are very important because they describe, at least for European regulation, they describe the context. They illustrate the goals that drives the legislator to draft this specific piece of regulation. And we should really be careful and pay attention to each single word used in the recitals that illustrates the goals, the objective, the reason behind a regulation, what the regulation should achieve, because those elements are of paramount importance and should never be forget. Those are the elements that we need to achieve. The regulation is an enabler. The regulation is a tool itself. So, given an example, if each single musician in an orchestra plays its own piece of music in the perfect way, does this imply that the symphony is perfectly played? No. Because we need the director of the orchestra that bring all together and manage each single musician in order to be part of the orchestra. So at the end, each single individual disappear, and suddenly you have the orchestra that appear. The sum, the result is the sum of each single individual. The sum and the orchestra go beyond. At the end, each single market infrastructure should really see itself in a wider spectrum, not only focus on be compliant like a tick box exercise, and then everything is done. No. The point is a market infrastructure as CSD participating to its own part of the game in order to bring its own contribution to the achievement of the goal? The goal have been perfectly remembered by Jennifer. Those goals are the element that we have to bear in mind. Those are not, how I will say, polar star, for those that, of course, are on the North Hemisphere. The point is exactly that we need to understand the regulation, look the regulation from the right perspective, implement the regulation in the appropriate way. But remember, the regulation is just a tool. Second element is that regulation is an enabler, meaning that regulation opens the door for an immense amount of services, opportunities. Very often, because of what I said before, that people consider that regulation is a tick box exercise, a very boring compliance exercise, they don't read between the lines the opportunity that regulation introduces. Very often, I heard counterparties exposed to CSDR, but also to EMIR, so the famous G20 framework came out from Pittsburgh meeting after the collapse of Lehman, about the fact that those pieces of regulation introduce very stringent and enormous amount of data that have to be reported. Yes, those data are important for NCAs, but I will say even more, and even go beyond. In Europe, the ESRB, central banks, to have an understanding of the reality. But then, nothing prevents CSDs, counterparties, participants, to leverage on the same data, to create and to extract value from those data. You can transform, your participant, your issuer, your clients, everyone, every single actors in the ecosystem can transform something that is currently perceived as a cost as a revenue. You can create a circular economy, a real sustainable economy within the financial market infrastructure ecosystem, if you starting from tomorrow morning, to leverage on the data that you have. Because on those data you can make valuable report for your executive, informative and informed decision. You can bring added value to your clients, nice reporting, risk management, everything. Don't waste the opportunity you have. We ask you to provide data to us. It's up to you to keep those data only for us or to use in a more intelligent way. By the way, if you use the data that regulator ask, you can implicitly improve the quality of those data. And therefore, immediately and without any effort, to fulfill the supervisory actions that NCAs ask to all supervised entity to improve the quality of the data. So at the end, I'm very passionate about talking about regulation because if you look at the regulation from the right perspective, everything works.
You can make money on it. Ilse, I saw you smiling. How do you feel as an instrument being conducted by regulation, and how to combine this with the economic aspect, the commercial aspect that Andrea just mentioned?
Yes, I think there is a word that hasn't been pronounced yet, which is competition.
Yeah.
And within the framework of the CSD regulation, it is perfectly possible for CSDs to compete. They compete on both sides, on the issuer side or the investor side. And it is there where indeed the CSDR is not, is incentivizing competition. It is not limitative either in the services a CSD can offer. So there is quite some freedom. The list of services a CSD can offer is free. So there is indeed possibilities to compete. And I think this is part of the equation we should not forget. If we look at issuer side, CSDR explicitly allows CSDs to choose the CSD of their choice. So we can play on that. We are. It's still limited, I must say. There is competition, obviously, well-known competition, less-known competition, but issuers have a role to play here. If they want this industry to consolidate or integrate more, they could also choose to change CSDs. So that's the issuer side, but you have the investor side, because CSDs, they serve both sides. You could have more investors on your books, which means then that basically you can have more attractiveness because you offer services on a whole raft of securities. This is typically what the ICSDs do because they have so many links, not just within the EU but also globally, where you can offer to your investor base a broad access to issuers all over the world. So competition is absolutely possible within the current regulatory framework.
So we get back to it's possible to make money within the regulatory framework. Attila, what's your view on this? And the small markets you mentioned and the state-owned CSDs, is it completely different or do you agree with what was just said?
Yeah, of course, I have to agree, of course, with that. There's a major fear, I think, that how the consolidation can kill all the small markets, but I would say that it's the other way around, because, okay, let's start from the beginning. That why we are talking about consolidation itself? It, as Jennifer mentioned, it's not a name, it's a tool. The aim is to provide, at least from our perspective, to provide a single access point to the issuers and investors to get access to a single pool of liquidity of all these market participants. That should be the aim, and we believe that consolidation can help achieve that. But it can be, but it means in practice, say in Central Europe, let's say, it is if we are talking about a single, let's say, pool of liquidity, it's a network of small local ecosystems of these small countries. But that means you need to develop these small local ecosystems parallel to developing the regional one. But that can be done only locally. There's no way you can develop the Polish capital market from Frankfurt. That will never happen. So you need the local ecosystem, you need the local infrastructure. And but the question is how these local infrastructure can work together. And the consolidation is a very good opportunity for the larger markets to increase their efficiency and find some new opportunities, business opportunities. But for the smaller market, it is a must to survive. Otherwise, these markets will be marginalized. That's I think, the major fear for all these markets.
Yes, it's really the question: how do the markets link between themselves? So how far can we actually go? We have such different legal grounds. We mentioned earlier cross-border activity. It's not easy. Jesus, what's your experience on this front?
For me, what is really important is more than consolidation is integration.
Integration.
I think that we had in the past a fragmented landscape in the CSD industry. Still, there are many CSDs. Always in all the panels have been confronted with the question why there are so many CSDs in Europe. I think, as Ilse said, it's not the question. The question is we have to be interconnected, we have to be integrated, we have to be able to avoid the isolation of our local domestic infrastructures. Consolidation has already happened. Competition is not only a possibility, absolutely true. It's already happening. Competition among the CSDs is already happening. Every year this competition is increasing, not only in the settlement space because of T2S, but also in the user side, in the user CSD side, and the registration side, also in the asset services side. So we will see that in the coming years there will be more and more competition, and this is good because then with competition, with the clear rules, the level playing field in the CSDR reviewed, I think all of this will allow the market forces, and I'm fully believer of the market forces, when they are possible and when they are on a level playing field, to have consolidation sooner or later. And I think that is extremely important. And of course, harmonization for integration is key, is a must. Because actually it's the only way to allow to be integrated, interconnected, to be linked within different CSDs, and we are going ahead with this harmonization slowly, but still we are in the same road, and we have had Giovannini barriers 20, 25 years ago. Still there are some of them from the public sector, by the way. And I know that the public sector are doing their best, because it's not just that the European Commission or ESMA that they don't want to. It's that sometimes fiscal issues is a competence of the member states. But I can tell you, for cross-border business, the most complicated barrier that we are still have in place is fiscal different treatments in withholding taxes. This is, for those who have links, for some markets, it's a nightmare to be linked to some other markets because of these different withholding tax procedures.
And would you say that's the reason why there are not more links, or why some links exist but are not active?
Well, that's one of the reasons. It's not so easy. There's many reasons, and we have to really understand why some links are very much used, others no. The roads are there sometimes. Unfortunately, sometimes the roads are not used by the participants, especially for the equity side. Different reasons. Asset services in the equity side is extremely important. Maybe CSDs, we are not yet in the situation to fully fulfill the asset services needs that the clients demand, maybe because it is necessary sometimes banking licenses or banking services. This is discussed in the review of the CSDR, definitely. Some CSDs, we are very aware of this. There are many different reasons to see that the cross-border links are not still used as we thought they could be used.
So Andrea, how to play the perfect symphony then? How to achieve the perfect integration that will drive growth of the market?
Well, in order to be consistent, I said we need to keep in mind that the goal, I mean, at least in our context, is transparency, efficient capital market, access to issuers and investors, having safer CSDs, Overall, I will say contributor to market stability and also to the market anti-fragility in order to be able to pass through the different crises that sooner or later happens, because this is something that we cannot avoid. We need to of course, facilitate competition in the sense that CSDs should and could offer the best service they can to their clients, irrespective if they are, or both, issuer and participants. What is important is to bear in mind, as I said before, the objective. You are financial market infrastructure. CSDs, like CCPs, are the backbone where all the players intervene after. I usually said, talking about the importance of CSDs, and by the way, the importance of the role that the CSDR give to NCAs, that CSDs in somehow can be seen as central banks of securities. And since central banks have not been authorized by anyone, any authority, our duty in somehow is unique. But the role of CSDs is also unique. So, and therefore integration is possible. We can even expect, or technically somebody can even hope there will be more integration in order to have more efficient, but once again, is a tool to achieve the goal. The goal is to have efficient capital markets, stable capital market, resilient capital market, free access, reduce the cost, but always be able to ensure that the market is safe enough to avoid major problems. And in terms of competition and in terms of integration, I will say that let's say links and interconnectedness of CSDs. Anyway, a way you can look at CSDs is, I will say, the airport. And some of them are hub for a regional area. So many of you have reached Prague, not with a direct flight from your respective city. You fly through either Frankfurt, London, Lisbon, Madrid, Paris, in order to come to Prague today. So in somehow links and CSDs can play a role. It is important that you don't forget that you work together, because there is one common single market, which is the market that brings together all CSDs link each other.
Attila, you like to answer?
A couple of years ago, we had a project in Central Europe with local CSD linking to other Central European CSD, and that was a proof that how difficult it is to link CSDs. It was extremely painful process, and the long one, very complicated and costly, and that was only one link between two CSDs. Mm-hmm. And the last couple of months, I had the chance to meet with several Central European countries, stakeholders, investors, issuers, and this question was put on the table of course, consolidation and what are the major problems. And of course, still the big elephants were mentioned, the taxation, corporate actions, and of course, currency. Yeah. We are talking about, we never talk about currency, of course, in the EU, in the Eurozone, that's not an issue, but in Central Europe, that's the biggest elephant still. And okay, if you just take a look at, okay, we are in Prague. Prague Stock Exchange and Vienna Stock Exchange working together in a single shareholding structure. And still, if you see if you look at from outside, it would be obvious to assume that, okay, the two CSDs works together, but they don't. So they are fully separated, and we cannot blame on that, because they made a very, let's say, economically, let's say, justifiable decision on that, because there are so many differences between the two countries' setups that it did not make sense at all to talk about further integration of the infrastructure. And what we expect in other countries where there are no such, let's say, strong relationship, like in case of Czech Republic and Austria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the perfect segue to our conclusion. If I could ask each of you to name the single most important thing that the public or the private sectors could do, should do, to achieve what was actually the topic of this discussion, deeper capital markets union. Would you say, Attila, that you mentioned the fiscal legal barriers? Is that the single most important thing, or somebody else?
For me, from my side, yes, definitely.
Yes.
To remove these big elephants, that would be enough, more than enough. And to be honest, from that point, I think this question, whether CSDs are linked or consolidated, will not be applicable at all. So no one would care about that from that point.
Ilse?
Well, I'm going to be a bit controversial, but I don't think the post-trade is the barrier for capital markets union. I think we deliver pretty well on our mission. If you want deeper capital markets in the EU, a lot more has to happen. And if you see how much money there is sitting on the savings accounts in the EU, which is trillions, we should find a good narrative, basically, to the savers to say, well, maybe you have to support your economies by putting money at risk. Because that's what capital markets basically are. And we know Europe is very risk averse. I mean,
in some countries more than others.
If we want more growth and more innovative companies, etc., we need money flowing to them, which means risk-taking. But we don't see that narrative, and I think it's because the politicians don't dare to pronounce that. So it comes basically down to possibly a better economic and financial literacy to understand the importance of putting money at work
into the economy.
For the economy.
Yeah. Good. Very interesting point of view. Jesus?
I would like to ask for the regulators in terms of regulation to be a little bit more realistic in terms of timelines. I think the market really is exhausted. It's not that we do not want to do it. It's just that we need time to do it. And there are so many regulatory projects on our plates at the same time that there are now problems to find out talent, which is getting more and more complicated to gain and retain. And it's not just only a question of cost, it's that whenever there is no resource available, you cannot find it. So the point is that, following your example, Andrea, I know that this is a very good example of the orchestra, but the feeling that we have is that there are three orchestras trying to play at the same time. And then we do not know what is the most important one. We have those projects stemming from the European Commission and ESMA. We have those projects from the Eurosystem, the European Central Bank. And of course, we have our own local NCAs, our supervisors, with the domestic and local regulatory projects, all of them at the same time. And sometimes there is an overlapping which is not possible to tackle in a reasonable way the three different orchestras at the same time. So actually, it is extremely important for us, let me say, to ask for not only to be practical in terms of these three orchestras to be coordinated in the timelines, but also, and this is my second request, now that I dare.
Yeah, please dare.
Sometimes even your own regulation, not only you, but also the others, regulatory projects, the deadlines, the implementation dates are established once the level 1 legislation has been released. But there are many technical details to be clarified, level 2 and level 3. Many occasions we have seen some regulatory projects, very important, that not only few months ahead, just few weeks ahead of the implementing date, there were very important technical details to be clarified, and that we had to change our codes that we were writing and testing again and again. And that's really not only for us, take into account that we are a sort of hub. Behind us, there are many participants in the market that at the same time they have to do the same as we have to do, and that we all have to test all together everything and retest and retest. This is getting a nightmare for us.
We're exhausted, yeah. And the music coming out of three orchestras is not nice. Andrea.
Well, I will say, going back to your question, but I take the point that you raised. And go back to your question, I will say, and I I'm pretty agree with what Ilse said. I mean, in order to improve the capital market union in Europe, I will say that the post-trading experience and CSDR goals could and should be spread beyond post-trading and go back to the trading and potentially even the pre-trading, because CSDs, as mentioned already by the colleagues here on the panel, are already well integrated. So in somehow, if you look at the post-trading world, T2S, etc., we are very close to have already achieved a kind of capital market union. So probably we need to go outside the post-trading itself. Indeed, capital market union, if I have to pick one element into CSDR that easily reminds me what is capital market union, is the cross-border provisional services. It is important that not only that we remove Giovannini barriers, but that we do not create other barriers that may prevent the cross-border provisional services. Otherwise, the capital market union will not, well, could be on paper, but not in the reality. And this, for me, once again, is the goal. So be aware of the difference between tools and objectives. Thank you.
Good. Jennifer, you're last, and you have a few requests there from...
I think maybe you asked about the public sector and the private sector. So maybe just focus for a few moments on both of them. I mean, first starting with the public authorities, I think the first thing that is needed is that the different member states, the different authorities, they adopt the CMU measures that we have proposed as quickly as possible in order to bring those benefits to the market and to investors. We have a wide range of different files on the table, different proposals to help us build a deeper, more liquid capital markets union. And I would urge the member states and the authorities, of whom I know there are quite a lot in this room as well, to try and help us to get those measures adopted as quickly as possible, and to help us ensure that they are designed and finalized in a way that helps us bring these benefits as well. As regards the private sector, I think, I hear the message, don't worry. And I can also tell you a little thing, a little side, what some of you, what majority of you don't know is while I'm here in Prague today, there are technical meetings going on working on the EU review of CSDR to try and get it finalized as quickly as possible, of course, at least from a technical perspective. And the one tip that I gave to my team who are sitting in those discussions today was don't look at the time frames. Don't look at them until the very, very last meeting when you know exactly what is going to be looked at and what is going to be required. And the very icing on the cake should be, have we got those time frames right? Do they work together? Do they make sense together? Are we giving long enough? And these are the questions we have to ask us at the last minute. We do our utmost, but it is not always an easy task, and I'm sure our colleagues in ESMA would agree that it's sometimes hard to anticipate all the questions and the issues that are going to come up. And that's why my final point for the private sector would be not only to take up the advantage of the opportunities we are trying to offer you and to try and give you, but also to think ahead. Think ahead, anticipate, and help us get it right.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I must say we've been extremely good on time management, which if you had listened into our preparatory work, we weren't sure that we had about 3 hours worth of conversation probably. And you can of course continue the conversation with each of us, but maybe we will have 1 minute for questions if there are any. Do we actually have a question? Good, thank you.
Thank you. This is Abdullah from Bahrain. I have a question is related to consolidation and integration, but before doing that, I think I just had a compliment on what Mr. Benito said regarding the regulators when they just put the timeline. I remember in early 2000, I have been appointed to be responsible as a regulator, so I was wearing for a period of time, 2 months, I was wearing two hats, CSD in charge and the regulator. And at that time, there was a regulation issued by the regulator, putting a timeline, and then I wrote a letter from me to me being as a regulator, asking for an extension. So next day I go there in my office, rejected my application. So, sorry, so this is how it looks when you are wearing, when you are on the other hand. So, I'm sorry, this is exactly what happened in early 2000. My questions to Mrs. Peters, I think it's related to the competition, and I think what I learned today from our colleagues, such a marvelous panel regarding, securities, when CSDs are acting as securities, central bank for securities, a new terminology we learned about the competition. I remember this. I think we as CSDs, we all complement each other. And WFC 2017, when it was in Hong Kong, we learned from the integration, Stock Connect between Hong Kong and Shanghai, and see how two different markets have been integrated. Integration could be another way of consolidation. We know that consolidation in some jurisdictions would be very difficult, and I think maybe we can deal or use the terminology sub-CSD, i.e. I could be a sub-CSD for the other CSD, like the global custodians and local custodians. Thank you.
It's a bit of the concept of a hub that was mentioned here as well.
I think we mentioned competition, but we forgot, maybe myself, to talk about cooperation. Because the same that we compete a lot, increasingly we compete, at the same time we're cooperating a lot. Actually, 5 years ago, it's not my creation. 5 years ago, there was a word that was created by I don't know whom. It was competition. And 5 years ago, 6 years ago, in some of these events, we were talking about that. It is true. I mean, we are cooperating a lot to seize this, T2S, for instance, but at the same time, we are competing, and I think it's working.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes?
One side observation on your personal note, just to give you the European way to solve your, let's say, conflict of interest is that we introduce a cooling off. So technically, you cannot address the letter that you received because in Europe you should have a cooling off period.
My question is for Andrea and Jesus. You have said that you love classic music, me too. But my question is, because sometimes in my life, I prefer jazz. And from an organization point of view, probably it's chaotic. But the symphony is amazing. So do you think that this could be convenient sometimes to allow the people just to work together without a very clear conductor?
Freestyle.
Yes, so I fully agree with you. And well, on a personal note, I will say that myself, like I think anyone who loves music, love any type of music. And by the way, last Sunday, I was in Rome for Bruce Springsteen concert. And just to say that, and I will go to any other concert I may, but because in reality, what I want to say in order to give you what I can consider be a meaningful answer to your question is just a thought about yesterday evening. We closed yesterday afternoon session with, on the background, the address of the venue for the dinner and the boat trip. Everyone was able to reach on time the boat. We left on time. Why? Because the goal was clear. The incentive were clear. So we haven't required regulators to arrange. So the point is, when the market is able to achieve the goal without any regulation, I would say, I think that we don't need to draft anything. So have you received the map with the, no. Have you heard that the Czech CSD arranged for a bus to bring all together because we were unable to reach? No. So it was a complete unregulated setup, but we achieved the goal. So the point is, regulation very often intervene when the market players, for many reasons, do not reach the goal. The goal is there, independently if there is a regulation or not. The advantage is that in the regulation, the goals are set, as I said before, at least in Europe, in the recitals. Very often, on a worldwide basis, the goals are also, in, for instance, in the CPMI principles. But in the CPMI, they are more principle-based, so you have a bit of flexibility, which not always allow CSDs to be fully and harmonized in order to ensure the objective that definitely in Europe oblige Commission to propose CSDR. So going back to your answer, yes, but nobody, I mean, not all people are able to play jazz.
So with this very clear call for action to the market forces, I would like to thank the panelists, thank you very much, and the audience for your contribution. Thank you very much.